We're going to switch gears with this PowerPoint to look at things other than bacteria that can be infectious agents to humans. So the first thing we're going to talk about are helminthic parasites of humans. These are worms, as we usually call them. Specifically, the one we're going to talk about is the cystodes group, commonly called tapeworms. And these are flat, segmented intestinal parasites. All tapeworms do also lack a digestive system, and they possess a very general same body plan as we can see here. They are hermaphroditic. They have both testes and ovaries. They are basically asexual in that, well, not asexual, but they are able to reproduce with themselves potentially or other parts of the tapeworm. And while you might see just one huge tapeworm here, if you were to break it apart, it's actually able to separate into multiple tapeworms. And each section can continue to be a separate organism. Something very interesting about tapeworms is that we are a part of the cycle. So this is a zoonosis usually for humans, where we've got eggs, and the eggs filled with the proglottids pass into the environment from feces. Feces gets contaminating onto food that another organism may eat, such as a pig, or in the case of some pigs, the actual feces itself. The eggs penetrate into a hatch, and then the larva penetrates into the intestinal wall and migrates to other tissues. That larva develops into what's called a cysticercus in muscle, and then the human ingests that cyst in raw meat, undercooked meat that's contaminated. And so, of course, when that enters the body, that cyst um, basically comes out of this formation, the cysticercus, and then attaches to the mucosa of the small intestine. As the scolex form that we saw before, which you can see over here, this thing right here is what attaches. And then the adult worm forms new proglottids, which can produce eggs that pass out of the body into the human waste. And again, the cycle can repeat. Something that's really interesting about this is that Victorian era, I have heard of women who have taken the eggs of this on purpose to develop, or maybe not the eggs, but the proglottids on purpose, so that they could have a tapeworm that would help them to be nice and skinny. Basically, the tapeworm gets to use the food that they eat, and helps to keep them skinny because it's malnourishing their bodies. And that's something I've heard people do. There are different kinds of the cystodes. There's the Tania. Tania saginata is the beef tapeworm. Tania soleum is the pork tapeworm. And then, of course, cattle and swine serve as the intermediate hosts. Humans living in close contact with livestock or potentially inadequate sewage treatment have highest incidence of infection. The adults will attach into our intestinal epithelium, and most individuals shed the strobila without having any symptoms. So you may actually have a tapeworm and not know it. In this cases, not to say that most of us are running around with tapeworms. We will eventually know this. But for people who are infected, it is possible to have it and be shedding it without realizing it. When the tapeworm potentially gets really large, it can cause an intestinal blockage. That's one thing to look for. And then diagnosis is actually based on identification of the proglottids in the fecal samples. So some of these, you actually look at the fecal sample itself, you go through it and under a microscope looking for these proglottids. There is a treatment. Praziquantel is a possible treatment for this medicine you can take. But one thing that you can do even better is to prevent this by properly cooking your meat. So this is one of the things that you want to do with pork. You want to make sure that you cook pork very, very, very well. Or in other cases, you might want to freeze the meat very, very, very well at certain temperatures. So sushi, of course, we don't cook. We actually have to freeze it, and that will also kill the cyst. There's also the dog tapeworm, the canine tapeworm, the Echinococcus granulosus, Then canines get infected by eating these cysticerci in various herbivore hosts. Humans are not usually infected with the canine tapeworm, but it is possible we can be accidental in intermediate hosts by just consuming food and water that's contaminated with dog feces. That's pretty disgusting to think about, right? It will cause a disease called hydatid disease, and this is where the larvae travel through the body and form hydatid um, cysts, and these are kind of fluid-filled cysts. If you want to see something very interesting, you can look up on YouTube and see hydatid cysts that have been are being removed from the brain, a human brain. And of course, the symptoms that follow enlargements of these cysts show up. So that's one way to find out that it's there. You can diagnose this by immunoassay. And if you're not sure what an immunoassay is, we've been talking about this already. When you do an assay looking for the different kinds of antibodies that are produced in the body, or neutrophils, basophils, those kinds of things, then you know that we have certain ones that show up with helminthic infections. And so you can diagnose that. You can also just look at visualization of cysts through an x-ray. I'll show you a picture of that here. And then you can treat with anti-helminthic drugs and surgical removal of the cysts, like I mentioned with the one in the brain that you can find on YouTube. Um, the best way to prevent this is just having good hygiene practices and not going through it at all. So here is a hydatid cyst in the brain. They do get rather large. And then this is a picture that was running around online a few years ago, and it claimed that this was a man, as you see in the title down here, Chinese man has tapeworms all the way through his body, cysts everywhere due to sushi and sashimi. Now, this was kind of a scare for eating in sushi and sashimi. If you're not sure what sashimi is, this is basically raw fish without the rice or anything involved like you have with sushi. The problem with this is it's actually an incorrect understanding. It's not related to sushi. Come to find out, this man had actually been eating undercooked pork, and he was getting these hydatids from the cysts from this undercooked pork, and so he was getting pork tapeworm, swine tapeworm, not from sushi. But this was a misunderstanding of how this worked. Now, could you get it from fish? Yes, potentially, but this is not the case here. And in the United States, there are laws regulating that food, such as sushi, the fish, because we're not cooking it, has to be put at a certain low frozen temperature for a certain amount of time to kill anything that might be cyst producing. Now we're going to look at DNA viruses, and so we're looking at the pox viridae. This, the first one, is going to be a double-stranded DNA virus, and they have complex capsids and envelopes. Capsids are the coating of protein around the genetic material, the DNA, and the envelope is the lipid coating around that capsule. Now remember, we talked about the difference between enveloped and non-enveloped viruses, and we know that the unenveloped, non-enveloped are a little more difficult to get rid of. Now this is the second largest viruses. They infect many mammals. Most animal pox viruses are also pretty specific, so if it's for a specific animal, it's for a specific animal, not usually able to infect humans with the inability to attach to human cells. The infection occurs primarily through the inhalation of the virus. Close contact is usually necessary for pox viruses to be transmitted. And there are a few diseases of animals that can be transmitted to humans, but for the most part not. And then all pox viruses produce lesions that progress through many stages, as we're going to see. So here is a virus under the transmitting electron microscope. You can actually see the DNA, the capsid, and then outside of it's the envelope. So you've probably heard this like pox be upon you kind of thing, and then we're talking about, this is an old style saying, and basically you get the pox, and in this case this is a virus, as we've seen. And maybe you've caught on now that chicken pox are an example of this, where you get infected, this travels through the the body and reaches the skin, and then causes these lesions here that will eventually pop and cause a scar. Most of us have gone through having the chickenpox probably and have some scars that are from this, so we're familiar with this a little bit. Now, smallpox is also a pox in the genus Orthopox virus, and it's commonly known as variola. And there are two forms of variola: variola major, which causes severe disease with 20% mortality, and variola minor, causing a milder disease. Variola infects internal organs, causing fever, malaise, delirium, and it moves via the blood to the skin where it produces the actual pox. And then, so again, like chickenpox, scars result on the skin, especially on the face. Now, very cool. It's been a very, very bad disease in the past and in our history, and in fact, people have used it as a biological warfare. A lot of the Europeans actually used it to kill off many Native Americans, sometimes by accident and sometimes on purpose by taking blankets or other things that had been infected with or contaminated with smallpox, and then allowing those things to be sent to the Indians, which of course they would use, and then become infected. But now it is the first human disease ever to be eradicated completely. The last known smallpox virus was in 1977 in Somalia, and in 1980 it was declared the first smallpox ever eradicated. And the reason for this is that there's a very inexpensive, stable, and effective vaccine. There are no animal reservoirs, it's only in humans. And then there's a very obvious symptoms, so that when you get smallpox, it's very easy and quick to diagnose and quarantine. And unlike a lot of viruses where you can be asymptomatic, you cannot be asymptomatic in the smallpox case. And of course, you can only get it very close contact. Now, there are some stocks of the virus maintained in laboratories in the U.S. and Russia. So hopefully, no one will ever take it upon themselves to start creating another epidemic of smallpox, but it's possible. Now, another of these DNA viruses is the herpes viridae. This is the human herpes virus. Number 3, varicella zoster. You may be familiar with this because this is the one that produces chickenpox, which is varicella, and herpes zoster, which is what produces shingles, and it's the same virus. So for those of us that have had chickenpox, we have it dormant within ourselves, and then later on in life it can produce shingles. So it's a very highly infectious disease. It enters through the skin, through the respiratory tract or eyes. The virus travels via the blood from infection site throughout the body. You get characteristic lesions appearing for 2 to 3 weeks after the infection. The disease is very usually mild in children, which is good. Chickenpox in adults are typically much more severe. For those who don't get it early on in life and get it later, it's much worse on them. And then the latent virus can reactivate, reproducing a rash known as shingles. And this is very, 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 very painful from what I have seen. So, of course, you get the little ones with chickenpox covered all over their body, poor things. I remember having this when I was about 5 years old. My sister got chickenpox around the same time as me, and she was about 2 at that time. She only had 8 chickenpox that we can remember. And I'd always heard that people who don't get chickenpox very strongly are more likely to get shingles later on in life. Now, I don't know how true that is, but I do know that in my sister's case, she has developed shingles by her early, or right before she turned 20. I think she was maybe 19 when it happened. So which is very, very early and not normal. Because normally what happens is this initial infection moves up the spinal nerve, and then it kind of hangs out there, and some of the ganglions and nerve cells, and then it reactivates and moves back down the nerve at a later time, producing shingles, these big patches of very itchy, very painful places, and there's nothing you can really do for this. Now, this happened to her, but this is not normally something that's going to happen until you're probably after age 50 or older. I've seen my grandmother with this and a lot of older people, but not very, very, very rarely to have younger people. There is some connection to show that stress may help to reactivate it. And of course, college is a stressful time, so that may have been what did it. So diagnosis is pretty characteristic in chickenpox, very characteristic lesions. The shingles lesions are much more difficult to diagnose for certain that it's shingles. Chickenpox is good, is very self-limiting. So basically it runs its course and then goes away. Shingles also has to do that as well, but you have to manage the symptoms because it hurts a lot more. Prevention is just to try to keep exposure from occurring. And then since the virus is shed pretty easily, it's hard to do that. There are vaccines now for chickenpox and shingles, and so you can get chickenpox vaccines for children and shingles vaccines for older people to help prevent the shingles from reoccurring, like the reactivation of the virus. Now, I do want to address that it's called chickenpox, not because it has a chicken as an intermediate host or anything. I've tried to find out the reason why it's called chickenpox, and it's actually not completely certain. Maybe just in reference to it's just not very strong. It's not a very deadly or harmful virus, unlike smallpox. So maybe that's why it was called chicken. I don't know. I've not been able to get a definitive answer on that yet. Now, another herpes virus is the Epstein-Barr virus, sometimes known as EBV, and it can cause a number of different diseases. And this was a little more concerning. The transmission usually occurs via saliva. It's initial infection of the epithelium of the pharynx and the parotid salivary glands. The virus then enters the bloodstream and invades your B lymphocytes. So they become latent here, and they suppress the apoptosis of B cells. The immune response causes infectious mononucleosis, so you actually get mono from the Epstein-Barr virus. And so you'll see things where you have cytotoxic T cells kill virus-infected B lymphocytes. So this makes you really sick for a really long time, makes you very weak. So you'll see infection in adults producing way much more serious symptoms. And then there are some occurrences of where the Epstein-Barr virus can actually see cancer develop. It may turn on genes, from what I've been reading, that actually activate cancer, depending on various other things involved, which we're unsure of just at the moment. Extreme cases arise in individuals when there's a T cell deficiency. So the diagnosis for this is that some diseases diagnosed again by very characteristic signs like you see with mono. But then there's also cancers that are produced, and the treatment then for Burkitt's lymphoma, you have to take chemotherapy treatments. Mono patients are just treated to relieve the symptoms so that the body can then take care of the B lymphocytes that are infected on their own. And then other conditions actually don't have any effective treatment. And there's a lot of research going on with the Epstein-Barr virus right now, trying to understand how it can activate cancer genes. And it's hard to prevent this virus from being spread because it's very widespread and transmitted by saliva. So it's easy to transmit to people. And of course, if you've ever heard of mono being called the kissing disease, you understand why that's so easy to transfer.